All right. It is 7 o'clock and I am so excited for so many of you to be joining us this evening. I am Holly Lynn Lee at NC State University, and I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves in a moment, but you are here to hear about telling stories with data. And we're going to talk to you about tools and strategies that we've developed for building data fluency. Excuse me. Oops. All right. So let me allow my colleagues to introduce themselves. But I am a distinguished professor here at NC State, distinguished professor of mathematics and statistics education. And I'm also a senior faculty fellow at the Friday Institute. And I want to give a shout out to the Friday Institute of Educational Innovation for helping us host this webinar and facilitating all the registration. And so we are part of the Writing Data Stories project, and I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves. Michelle?
Thanks, Holly Lynn, and hi everyone. My name is Michelle Wilkerson. I'm an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley. I am in the Graduate School of Education and also in our science and math, or graduate group in science and mathematics education program. And I'm excited to be talking about this project. We've been working on it for 2 or 3 years now. And excited to share our materials. So I'll pass it to David.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Stokes, and I'm a graduate researcher at NC State. And my background is in statistics and education, and my interests include working with social sciences data, but really just data in general and the related teaching and learning. And I'll pass that to Charisse.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Charisse Mcbride, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at University of California, Berkeley. I'm particularly enjoying working on the Writing Data Stories project as part of my work with work on equity-centered learning environments. I'm particularly interested in teacher learning and also thinking about digital literacies. So I think I'm the only one on the panel who doesn't come explicitly from statistics or a science background in this way, but I've been really excited to see how learning looks in this space.
Mm-hmm. And I just for some orientation, so we are going to be using both the chat features and the question and answer feature. So in your chat within Zoom, you can send a message. There's a little drop down box and it might say host and participants. Right now, hosts and panelists, you might want to change that to everyone because there will be parts of the presentation where we invite some commentary and some free reflections, and we'd like you to use the chat box for that so that everybody can hear the voices of all of us here tonight. And then if you have a specific question that you would like answered, you can use the question and answer feature on that. And so you can find those all at the bottom. If you have your screen maximized, you should be able to see icons for those. If your screen is not maximized for Zoom, you'll have to use the 3 little dots to actually pull up a menu to find those options. We are offering closed captioning tonight. So if you would like the closed captioning option on, again, you can find that along your final, your bottom bar or under the 3 dots to add that feature to tonight's webinar. So the Writing Data Stories project started, as Michelle said, 3 years ago. And we all know that a good portion of the last 3 years has involved a pandemic. And so our project started out actually developing some very rich project-based learning units for science curricula within the context of middle schools. And, you know, we had some initial pilot tests of those materials, and then we all found ourselves teaching in quite a different environment. And so as all educators had to do, we had to pivot. And so we started creating some more smaller, what we're going to refer to as bite-sized experiences that could happen in educational settings in a variety of different contexts, not necessarily just science. And so throughout the presentation, you'll hear some of our larger approaches and strategies, and a little bit of snippets of some of the curriculum materials that we've created. All of these are available for free, and we'll be telling you about those at the end of how you can access those. And obviously this is being recorded, and every link that is being shared tonight and all the materials, we will send in a follow-up email so that you can have it all in one place as well. So what we'd like you to do is to think about the last time that you used data to make a decision in your own life. Can you think about what that phenomena was, or that situation was when you had to make a decision and you used data to help you? And if you could take a moment and in the chat box with everyone selected, just give us a one to 6 word answer of what that phenomena or situation was where you use data to help you make a decision. Aha, vehicles. I'm very quickly reading. Vehicles, wind direction, speed, thinking about retirement. Aha, buying groceries. Deciding when and where to wear a mask, scrolling up. Choosing a spot for coffee. Different medical treatments. Arrival times for the subway. Great. Great. Grading student papers. Yeah. Training for a race. Buying a bike, probably buying anything. Yeah. Timings of boosters, which dinner to purchase. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Choosing different schools. Okay. So, you're probably here tonight because you have thought about using data, and we've got to think about why should we be using data, emphasizing data fluency for our students in our classrooms. And I think most of us recognize that having data fluency is important for a lot of different jobs, and so we have to get our students to be career ready. But we also need students to be able to, we want our future students to be good citizens with us. We want to live in a world that has data fluent citizens that can help interpret things that they see in the media, things that are being used to convince them of different arguments, but also in ways that they can use data to make arguments themselves. So learning how to be be an advocate for causes that they care about, and being able to investigate and use data to help them in that advocacy. So when you imagine, this is another opportunity for you to respond in the chat. What do you think data fluency would look like for your students? So if you had students that were data fluent, what would it look like? And again, we invite you to be able to pop those into the chat, seeing some things come in. Evaluate truthfulness of data in the media. A data-driven mindset. Yeah, take a moment and scroll up through these comments to see what your colleagues and other participants are saying of what is important, what they imagine a data fluent student would be able to do. Using lots of different representations, making decisions. Oh, I like this, having data be present in almost everything they learn about. What questions should be asked. And so a lot of connections between data and being skeptical, being able to make arguments, being able to interpret what they see, as well as being able to know something that they want to know about and what data they could use to actually come to understand something that they're interested in. Nice. So if we think about data fluency, my good colleague Bill Finzer, who I saw is on here, as well as Kirsten Dollar, wrote an article recently thinking about data fluency. And, we kind of adapted what they wrote in their article just to give us some quick ways of reasoning around this. So, we consider it the ability to make contextual meaning of data. Data has context, and we want our students to be able to ask questions, interrogate claims and evidence, and connect it to the real world sources that data came from. I certainly saw that coming up in the chat. Knowing how and when to transform and visualize data. I saw it making representations and interpreting representations, connecting across data representations. Saw that also in the chat. Knowing how and when to manipulate data to answer a question. So being able to do things with data, or what we call data moves, and my good friend Tim Erickson has written a lot about that, and I saw him on here as well, such as filtering and grouping and summarizing data, merging and things like that. So teaching data fluency, there's opportunities for this across the curriculum. And I could show you specific examples and standards in every single one of these different disciplines, but I just want to highlight that if you look in the science standard, you see analyze and interpret data come up continuously. In literacy standards, you see things like the ability to evaluate hypotheses, data analysis, and conclusions in science and technical text and verifying data. It's there in social studies, being able to frame questions about events in the world in which we live and evaluate evidence. In math, you don't have to look too hard to see statistics standards explicitly in mathematics, and being able to have students make inferences and justify conclusions. And we also have computational thinking standards that really talk about leveraging the power of technological methods to develop and test solutions. So in our project, our favorite data tool is CODAP, and Bill Finzer is on this call, and he's actually a co-PI with us on the writing data stories. And through that, we've been able to actually influence some of the things and the features that are in CODAP. And we invite you to be able to see why we might think that CODAP is one of our favorite tools. It's free. There's no login requirement, completely works on your browser. It works best in Chrome or Firefox. And it really is optimal to be working on a computer, Chromebook, or some large tablet. It really isn't too optimal on a small phone doing large data investigations. I mean, you can certainly do some of it, but it's going to be a little clunky and hard to get around. And it's continually under development. So there's new features in there all the time. So I'm going to turn it over to Charisse. I'm going to continue to share the slides, but Charisse is going to talk to you a little bit about the kind of pedagogical considerations that we use in our project to teach data fluency.
Thank you for that introduction, Holly Lynn. So as Holly Lynn just said, we want to really pay attention to how we what kind of teaching we promote with this this project that we have. So as a project, writing data stories is really about equity and widening participation to data literacy. We're excited to partner with teachers in a variety of schools and with a wide range of students. And so to that end, we really take pedagogy seriously, and we specifically take an inclusive and equity-oriented stance toward learning. What that involves then is making sure we're valuing our students' cultures and histories with this subject matter, with these kinds of literacy practices, and with learning in general. For all of you here and for us as well as learning designers, we really want to consider how we're taking up and building upon our students' strengths, their cultural strengths, their unique experiences, and those of their communities, and really trying to step into their worlds of meaning making. So what we want to highlight is several questions that we can ask ourselves about making room for our students' repertoires of practice. First, with language, right? Not only named languages or sanctioned languages, but language patterns, the dialects that students are using. What home language practices do they engage, and which discourse communities are they a part of? Building on those can really help us to make sure that we're making room for how students communicate. Secondly, how are we building on their repertoires of practice with technology? these data tools that we're introducing, such as CODAP, they may be new, but we can also think about their digital literacies that already exist, such as being able to work with search criteria, or maybe making graphics and understanding the flow or layout of digital stories that they come across, whether that's on social media or on the web. Even filtering, how might they filter their search criteria and profiles and things like that. So building on what they already know is important to us. Third is history and culture. When we think about the topics that we explore with data, or like what has value, we want to really question and open space for where students find themselves positioned socially. Again, their experiences with family, community, and history. And this offers us an opportunity, again, to be inclusive in our pedagogy. And then the final one is disciplinary practices. Holly Lynn highlighted just a few minutes ago about how data fluency is relevant and integral across various subject areas. So with understanding that our Writing Data Stories project is interdisciplinary, yes, we think about what prior experiences students have in data or science, across science, areas of science, math, composition, and we also consider broadly the experiences they have in the social sciences, being able to interpret data and create stories in English or composition as well. So drawing from that knowledge of our students and their own kind of, places of meaning making, we want to ask, what might students already know and do across these categories? And the key there is making noticings, and then co-designing with our students to imagine where we might make room for those noticings. Another key part, this is the last thing I want to go over, is just thinking about our role as facilitators and how that might offer a space to disrupt patterns of inequity. So in these kinds of spaces with data literacy, we might find that dominant practices with discourse, specifically, what might be considered scientific language or official discourse, that when those practices become inequitable, who's speaking and how they're speaking, or who is who we make space for, that can translate into discounting what kind of knowledge is valued, whose knowledge is valued. And so when we see certain discourse practices being dismissed or marginalized in our classrooms, it's really up to us to mitigate those patterns and to imagine how we might make more room for students to express themselves with language and with different representational systems. So the key here, I think, is inviting opportunities for students to share their thinking, both publicly and privately. So publicly may look like creating opportunities for students to discuss shared visuals or artifacts, coming together to think about a particular object, express themselves with gestures and pointing at data. And some of the examples we'll give in a second will kind of make this a little more concrete. But the key is allowing students to share their thinking publicly together, even using digital tools such as the chat, like we're doing here, or rainstorm, as Michelle has coined it, where there's an opportunity for everyone to share their thought at the same time, for example. The key, though, is also giving them space to think about privately, maybe even before they share publicly, thinking about their ideas, reflecting on artifacts, and having a chance to really engage the information. And so we have several strategies that we actually have more in our curriculum toolkits that we'll share with you. But what we want to really emphasize is that pedagogically, there are opportunities to disrupt. We have to pay attention to inequities that might emerge, and then opportunities to disrupt those. And so with that, we now get to some of the really fun stuff of being able to dig into the data bites themselves, which are usable materials for your classroom. So I'll pass it on to David for that, I believe.
Okay, so if you're wondering how you can actualize these amazing ideas in your classroom, this is a brief example and part of the inspiration for creating the data story bites, or data bites for short. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to give you a point of reference, they're similar to the New York Times, what's going on in this graph, or the data talks, if you're familiar with those. But what sort of sets these apart is the framework that's kind of focused on socio-scientific and socio-critical perspectives. And each of these activities is connected to a standard, and they have a visualization. They're kind of designed to encourage students to use their backgrounds and think critically about the data investigation under consideration. And I will talk more about that in the next slide that presents the framework. But these are also designed to be very flexible, like 30 minutes or less, or they could even be an extended standalone lesson. And that was also something that came out of the development during the pandemic, but also they can be in your current teaching environment integrated very easily in different ways, and they're designed to give you that flexibility. And also, there's different modes. You can have it as an individual type of activity or a group-based activity, and each of them are linked to a data source, and some are as well linked to a data set that you can get into, and there's an example of that we will show you. And also there's a teacher guide, and they're fully bilingual, and more details about that will be coming shortly as well. So the next slide kind of presents our framework, and the first category is about making sense. And this is getting students to kind of start off with, if they don't know where to start, what do they notice up front? And what are the trends and relationships in this graph? And what do the patterns mean? How can they connect those patterns to the science concept? And an example question from that section is, what is the first thing you think about or wonder when you see this graph? And that may be familiar to some of you, but it's a very good place to start for them to get started with analyzing the visualization or the data. And the next section is about building personal connections. And this is where you want students to consider how their own lives or communities may be impacted by the patterns that are being reflected in the data. And an example item from that would be, which people or groups do you think would feel more or less of a connection with the data or trends here? And then moving on to the reflecting on the context and history section. This is more about who collected the data, who was counted in the data, why did they choose to visualize it in that manner, what may be hidden or missing, and more critical thinking types of questions along those lines. And an example item from that section is, who do you think made this graph? Why did they collect this information? What do they want to know? And then the last major section is about envisioning future uses, and that's more about extending the investigation and what can you do with it beyond what you see here in this graph. And an example item from that includes, what data or measurements could you collect to make the topic in this graph applicable to more people? And personally, one of the things I like about this framework is that it feels very intuitive, which I think lends itself well to being implemented across different types of curriculum. But at the same time, it may seem novel in something like a science environment, if you think back to your personal experiences or your current teaching methods. But again, this is something that can easily be integrated due to its flexibility, and is can be supplemental in that sense, or even a standalone type of lesson. So on this next slide, this graph is actually from a New York Times What's in This Graph data visualization, and it's based on an article from 2016 about what's healthy and whether or not Americans and nutritionists agree. So I would just like you all to just kind of take a minute to take in the visualization. And if you notice something interesting or anything that you'd like to note, please just paste that in the chat, and so everyone can kind of see it, just to give you all a chance to interact with the data. Okay, so one of the more interesting things for me, which also was brought up in the article, were sort of these outliers on the far right side, where there's a big disagreement between Americans and nutritionists. So those are some points that your students might notice and might kind of start off their comments around. So moving on to the next slide, this activity has actually been extended into underlying data set where you can access it through CODAP, and students can explore more about the data, as well as they can add more information that they've gathered. And there is also more information beyond the particular data in the graph with some missing data that students can go in and add to or try to understand why that may be missing. So again, this activity is something that can be extended. And in addition to this data set that students can work with, there's an article about the data in this particular graph, as well as the CODAP interaction that you all can check out as well at this link here. And thank you for your time. And next, you will all get to see another example that Michelle will present to you.
Thanks, David. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen since I'll be sharing some materials as well. All right. So we're going to go through another very brief example. This one focused on climate threats. And we really wanted to show you two examples from pretty different subject areas just to show the wide applicability of the work. And I see there's a hand raised, so I wonder if now's a good time to actually take a question. There's also this Q&A feature. Okay, I'll pause also after the second demonstration and we can see if we can take that question as well. So before we start this one, I actually want us to do another little rainstorm. I want you all to think about a place that's special to you. And this is pretty broad. A place can be a specific location, it can be a country, it can be a region, it can be a room, it can be a corner of your house. But think about a place that's special to you and go ahead and type it in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes. And if you've already typed it, feel free to go ahead and think about some of these other prompts you see on the screen too. Why is this place special? How does it make you feel? What does the environment in that place look like and feel like? And I'll give everyone one more little bit of time. Okay, and then I'm going to count down from 3 and have you all hit enter. And this is that rainstorm thing that, that Dr. Charisse talked about earlier. So 3, 2, 1, enter. There we go. Oh yeah, rainstorms are so refreshing. So we have ocean, my living room couch, a rainforest. Then we have some specific locations: Oregon coast, Martha's Vineyard, home, Ocean View Boulevard, San Francisco. This is great. All right. So the reason I'm starting this one off here is that while I am going to demonstrate a data bite, I also wanted to give you a little glimpse into some of our larger curricula and how we start to involve some of students' repertoires in the ways that Charisse talked about earlier. So this is actually a question that we ask students in an in-classroom weeks-long curriculum. Where's a place that's special to you? Why is it special to you? We have students interview family members or at times do research on that place to think more about how climate change has impacted the way that that place feels. And so here you see just a few samples of those, the results of those interviews and reflections. And this curriculum actually moves in a very similar way to our data bites through sort of connecting to the personal, using that as an entry point to data. So having students identify their special place and then look at a data set with specific focus on their special place, and then back up and say, okay, now let me look at a larger set of data and see how my special place compares to other people's special places and to sort of averages globally. And in this curriculum, it actually gets us into a conversation around who's most responsible for and vulnerable to climate change. So we look at carbon emissions, for instance, and impacts of climate change in different places around the world. And as Leland said, we don't have a lot of time in just an hour to dig into what that data looks like in CODAP, but this is the data set that we actually use as part of that curriculum, so students can really zoom in on their special place. Here it's special place as connected to a country, but then sort of start to compare past that. And so now we're going to go back to the data bite version of this. And so this is another visualization from the New York Times. It includes a number of different climate threats that you might experience. So for those of you who dropped a special place or just thought of a special place, see if you can find it here. Take a few minutes. Think about what you notice. Feel free to, if you want to drop an observation in the chat, feel free. No, you're not required or asked to. Okay. I will say, let's go to the next one. So now we're going to move through that sequence that David sort of previewed earlier, starting with making sense. How might we go about making sense of this visualization with students? And so again, we might ask, what's the first thing you think about or wonder when you see this map? What do you notice? Okay, and I'm starting to see some observations here. Weather extremes are more pronounced. Water is a big problem. Oh, so yeah, just looking at how much of the space, the geography of the US deals with water. And I see the yellow area, but I think also the blue area is a different kind of water problem, right? Rainfall. So these are general questions we can ask. We also have a set of prompts that are more specific to how to really dig into these visualizations with students who might not be used to looking at and sort of deconstructing data visualizations, especially because they're so different these days. So you're not always just looking at a line graph. These visualizations can use all kinds of different symbolic representations. No frost. Okay, so we have some questions around there's no freezing or frosting risk. Sea level rise is another type of water problem. So to dig even further in, we do have, and we'll share with you, a PDF of specific strategies and prompts you can use during the making sense of data phase to really dig in and deconstruct what these look like. So for instance, unpacking the visualizations, how is space used? So here it's a map, so we get a sense of how space is used here. But what is meant by these little colored spaces? What are these spaces anyway? Are they counties? Are they zip codes? How does that affect the way that these things are measured and talked about? How do parts of this visualization map to specific measurements? So again, thinking about what are regions here? How can you encourage students to move between local data points, so that specific point that matters to you, and global data patterns, and start to make sense across those? How can we look for clusters or groups? And so here we can look at clusters the way you all are looking at clusters, which is to say, oh, I see a really big yellow region, right? In contrast to, for instance, these red regions. But we can also think about clusters like you did with the last nutrition graph, where David and other people in the chat noticed that there was this cluster of stuff that, you know, everyday Americans, as they're called, think is healthy, but nutritionists do not think is healthy. That's kind of the danger zone. So how can you think about these different, really specific ways of going back and forth in a graph and extracting meaning from it? So I won't spend too much time here, but I encourage you all to check out that, that document, and Holly Lynn just dropped it in the chat here. If you want to spend some time and effort really getting into how do we dig in and make sense of these things. Once you have a sense that you know how to read the graph and notice patterns, then you can get into these personal connections. So a question might be, does this map help you understand how climate affects you? What other information would you want or need to better understand how climate affects you? And so one thing I noticed, I'm here in the Bay Area, we're characterized by kind of wildfires, but then there's also right next to us this blue, and then there's also right next to us this yellow. And wildfires are a big problem, but so is water stress. So for me, I kind of thought, how would you represent a region that's stressed by multiple climate issues? And what are you losing by sort of forcing to pick one color versus somehow representing that intersection, for instance? So that might be one way to start thinking about what are the benefits and drawbacks of different kinds of visualizations and what kinds of assumptions can you make and maybe not. Another question might be, I don't know if we had any, so we had a couple of people talked about like the rainforest, the ocean, and some people might have favorite places that are not in the United States. So what does it mean that this visualization is focused on the US and sort of omits international or global perspectives? For instance, there are regions globally that are much more affected by climate change than we are so far. And how can we talk about that and what's missing from this? Moving to context and history, we might have a conversation about what could you do with this data set to make it more useful for yourself or others who might not be included here. So how would you try to create this at a global scale, for instance? Or how might you take into account the fact that some places are stressed by multiple different threats and others might have one very serious threat only? I'm sorry, I have to step out. My baby is screaming in the other room. Is anyone okay jumping in for a quick sec there? Thanks.
Yeah, I can jump in, Michelle. So let me transfer.
I can just grab them and then come back to move the slides.
That's okay. I'm going to transfer the slide deck over to me. I'm going to go ahead and share. I think this is where she left off. Is this correct? She was on context and history. All right. Okay, great. So one of the things that I popped in the chat was a link to the interactive version of this graph. And as Michelle was talking about, you know, what was actually measured on each of the different counties. And if you use the interactive version, you could actually show, you can interrogate that county and see for each of the different types of climate stress, climate impacts like water stress, extreme heat. It will actually show for that particular county whether there was a low or high risk. And you can see that it actually had, that the creators of this graph had to choose one color. And I think that was what Michelle was getting at. And, you know, so for counties that actually had more than one really high, one might think about that it might be more useful to actually in some way be able to show that there are some equal, just as equally likely risks for a particular area. But, you know, we also want students to think about this connection to their area, to their own personal geographic area, and thinking about what other data that they would like to collect. So, you know, if these are the different climate change impacts that are happening, are there particular things happening near them that might be leading to some of these water stress or hurricanes or things like that? And then one of the things that we ask students to do in, you know, really living in this, bringing in ideas around literacy, is thinking about their future uses as well. So if you had to write an article about the threat, what would the headline be? What might be missing from that article? So again, getting into that future uses, like if you're writing an article about this just from the data that you see here, what might be missing, and what might you be wanting others to kind of consider and think about and use data for in the future? Sorry, I've got multiple screens going, but let me stop here for a second. We do have another question that was in our Q&A, and there might be others at the time. And this question was actually posed for Dr. McBride with thinking about some of the pedagogical strategies that she was talking about earlier. And so, Charisse, let me just turn it over to you and see if you'd like to answer that question, or if you want to think about it in terms of some of our curriculum materials.
Sure, thank you. So I love this question around integrating learners' everyday language. And as we do this, of course, in teaching data literacy, I think it's important to note that, of course, language is intricately connected or reflective of culture. And so what we, the way that we look at it is offering spaces of, for example, flexible language use. We talk about translanguaging, which is really the practice of engaging multiple languages, and sometimes at the same time in certain contexts. So there's the actual like patterns of speaking with one another through certain languages, and allowing students to bring in concepts and words that may not be reflected in the data, whether that's in the nutrition data, and being able to share elements of their cultures and what might be missing from the data. If Michelle wants to talk a little more specifically about that nutrition unit, she worked extensively to kind of reflect on what language practices students brought to bear in making sense of quote unquote healthy foods, particularly in different cultural contexts. But I do want to mention that there's it's not just in thinking about, again, named languages, but as students interpret data and they're able to sort of, maybe tell stories about that data based in their everyday experiences. So this notion of everyday language also invites everyday experiences to come forward, and students being able to really use like a range or a repertoire of communication practices, different modalities, being able to do gestures, thinking about their tone, thinking about the full repertoire of how students communicate, both in terms of content and mode. So yeah, I think widening that participation around languages is kind of the big idea. Michelle, do you have specific examples that you can think of?
Let me give a quick example too, just that is pure kind of statistical. So if you imagine the graph that we were showing before of the scatter plot of the foods, or imagine a number line with a distribution, kind of showing the distribution of calories in certain kind of cookies, all right? And that one of the things that students might talk about informally is saying, wow, there's like a bunch of the foods over here, or there's like a clump of the foods over here. And they use these informal ways of talking about where data is centered. All right. And so we can use that and adopt that kind of language of like, yeah, like find the clumps, find where things are bunched up. Because it uses their language and their perspective and their perception of what they're seeing, instead of jumping into saying, well, we want to look for the mean, and only officially using the kind of statistical language that we might want them to adopt. So that's just a quick pure statistical example. Michelle?
Yeah, and I've got a couple of other examples. I guess I'll say three in a row. One is in the Data Story Bites teacher guide, which I think Holly Lynn is linked to and will be sending to everybody. We actually have glossaries in English and Spanish, so just allowing both languages to be used. And he's real mad, or sort of with reference to working with data. So that's kind of a more formal named languages way, like Charisse was talking about. Thinking informally, a couple of examples that come to mind. One is, as we have students tell stories, a common time when languages will flip is when you want to use emphasis, or you want to evoke emotion, or you want to connect to the everyday. So if you're advocating for a particular thing, we had one example where another person on our project sort of put tenemos poder, we have power, within an English language sentence about data and what needs to be done next. right? So using it as a call to action based on data and a part of the data in that way. Another way is, which I think is one of the examples Charisse was alluding to, is when we had students look at nutritional data sets related to the data bite that David talked about, but sort of in more depth, we did give them a data set with a number of different breakfast options, but they also had the opportunity to add their own everyday breakfasts. And so it's another example of not necessarily a different named language, but saying, you don't just have to work with what we're giving you. You need to bring yourself to this. And some of the student groups noticed that the breakfasts that they were already having were healthier than all the options we were giving them, right? And so how can you sort of allow that fluidity for them to bring themselves? I'll stop for now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let me, I believe you guys can see the screen curriculum and resources. And
I think we had one more question that is in the attendees. So I'm just gonna allow that person to talk.
all right, let's see, another question. So there was another question that was about the use of Excel. And if you go to the question and answer, it's actually in the answered now. But someone had asked about whether that was a good idea to teach data fluency using Excel, the kind of pros and cons to that. And I responded to that thinking, yeah, I mean, our children have access to spreadsheets, whether it's Excel or Google Sheets. And so those can be a good tool because it's something that they're going to have access to in the real world. But I find the visualizations and spreadsheets that are not very intuitive to create. And so, for example, for initial learners, they really can create barriers because you have a hard time creating, you're very much constrained about the kinds of visualizations that you can create in Excel. And it's really hard to go back and forth between your data and the visualization and to make connections between individual cases, individual dots, for example, in a graph. So like, again, going back to that nutrition scatter plot, you want students to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, I think somebody had said something about wine should be a little bit higher on the graph. You want to be able to investigate the icon for wine by clicking on it and then going to your data and actually investigating it. And that's really hard to do in Excel. It's hard to navigate. And so I think it prohibits some learning that we have found through decades of research in statistics education that can be helpful for kids. And let's see, is there any other answered asked questions?
One question here in the chat. I think Yvonne wanted to ask specifically about how we use students' tacit knowledge.
And their emergent conceptual knowledge. Yeah, so I think that's a loaded question. That's a hard one. I mean, there's not a simple answer of how do you build upon that. But I think that if we go back to the pedagogy strategies that Charisse was sharing earlier, you want to honor and hear their voices so that you can get some insight into what their knowledge is and have conversations about it and introduce academic language and academic content when it is appropriate. So, I mean, I remember the first time that I had two kids create a scatter plot, and they had never been introduced to a scatter plot before. And I didn't start off by saying, let's create a scatter plot. I said, okay, you're looking at this variable. So let's add this other variable over here on the vertical axis. And they drug it over and created this. And they were like, oh, wow. And so I introduced the language of a scatter plot, but I said, but don't worry about that. You're going to learn about that later as far as that language. I just want you to make sense of what you see, and so I didn't get hung up on introducing them to the vocabulary in a deep way. I just named the graph and then took it back to their sense making. And so I think that if you continually keep in mind that you want to have that back and forth between understanding what they know and their emergent knowledge, along with the standards and the content that we're responsible for teaching our students, and that you want to always have those conversations back and forth, that can help you in your teaching.
I just want to say one thing, that I think the notion of validating is really important there, and honoring the work and the knowledge that students bring. So explicitly making it a point that that's valuable, what you've said, and we can learn from that. And we're here to learn this, like practice the language together as well. So validating what students are already demonstrating, but also demonstrating some alignment and saying, what you're saying can also be said this way, and that's how people in this discipline might recognize it. So we're expanding, our language use.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
I think Anne has a question also.
Oh, let's see. I'm sorry. Where is that question?
I think Anne had their hand up earlier. Was that what it was?
Anne's got a hand up, and Anne, you should be able to unmute and talk now, if you're there. Okay, so maybe it's, oh, okay, the hand just went down, all right.
Okay. So as Michelle and David mentioned earlier, we do have a teacher guide to go along with our data story bites, and we're going to give you the link for where you can find all of these free materials. And one of the things that we tried to do is to give several examples. We have, I think, a collection. David, you might know better than me. I think we have perhaps around 8 or 9 data bite examples, and that hopefully, if you learn to use this framework, we want you to be able to create your own data bites by finding graphs that would be interesting to your students. So that's the last bullet there, of having a toolkit for being able to create your own data bite. Just to give you a sense of what our slides look like, and the fact that they are bilingual. So we have, for example, a representation that they're trying to make sense around. And we have our questions in both English and Spanish throughout every single one of the slides. These links here are to our other curriculum materials. So if you go to this particular website, if someone could copy and paste that into the chat. And again, all of these links will be sent in a follow-up email that will get sent to you, along with a link to the recording of the session. But this project page gives you links to go and find our materials and a little bit more about us. Has a great video where Michelle kind of explains. You'll recognize her voice when you listen to the video. That explains a little bit about our approach in a shorter, like 3 to 4 minute bite-sized representation, and links to our curriculum materials. We put everything up in Google folders and have everything accessible for you all to use. So Michelle, do you want to try to do this slide, or would you like me to?
No, I got it. Thanks.
Okay.
To everyone. The baby was sleeping, so he did not go to school pickup. That's what happened there. And then he woke up immediately. So we are hoping to partner with some teachers, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, for this coming year. As Holly Lynn mentioned at the very beginning, we had started this work collaborating closely with teachers and doing work in classrooms. And of course, as you all know, COVID sort of interrupted all of that work. So now we're hoping that as things recover and we sort of figure out however we're going to move forward, we're able to start building those closer and co-design relationships with teachers again. So if you're interested in this work, would like to integrate any of these existing activities into your own instruction, interested in co-designing new curricular units with us, anything sort of along that spectrum, we'd love to talk to you. Please feel free to email the writingdatastories@berkeley.edu or contact any of us, and we'll get it to the rest of the team. Happy to answer any questions about that with the little time we have here. And we have a question about if it's for K-12 level or college level data courses. And it looks like Charisse is typing an answer. I'll just say we designed it for mainly middle school through sort of early high school, but the framework itself is very flexible. So I would imagine you can apply the framework where making sense of data suddenly means making sense of this linear regression, right? And personal connections means personal connections in terms of what can I do with this as a researcher, or what does this mean in terms of policies that impact me? So I think that the framework itself is very portable, but the more concrete curriculum that we have prepared is mainly for the middle school level. Oh, and welcome from the land down under. That's great that we've got international presence here. I think we've got 5 minutes, so be happy to take more questions.
We will keep this 7 to 8 time frame in mind for anything that we do in the future, since it seems to be working on different continents. Sometimes scheduling meetings even within our own continent is a challenge.
Yeah, and we'd love to hear even just informal messages. If you, would like to use some of these materials with your students, we'd love to hear how it goes. Yes, this time is very popular. And I also just wanted to mention, you may have mentioned this, Holly Lynn, but in our teacher guide for the Data Stories Bites, we also have a more general toolkit. So you can develop your own prompts for other visualizations that you're using. And so that toolkit comes with English and Spanish prompts that are pretty generic, but that you can replace some of the ideas with the more specific things you want to get to. Gapminder is great. Another great one is Social Explorer if you're looking at the university level. So there's a lot of sort of visualization tools that this kind of approach we think would fit well with.
Yeah, and absolutely, our materials are created under a Creative Commons license, and we, it's all of them are available for free. We want them to be used by anyone, adapted by anyone to fit your particular context, take our ideas and make them your own so that they fit within the context and the students that you work with.
There's a question: do you need coding to create the visualizations? So we've been using most of the materials we showed today. The visualizations already existed in the media. And so we're sort of borrowing them and building structure around them. Depending on the tools you're using, if you want to create visualizations at the university level and use this framework with it, you might need to code. But in general, anyone can do this without coding as long as you have a place to find visualizations.
Right. And in our longer curriculum units, the project-based learning units, when we're using CodeApp, you do not need coding to create visualizations within CodeApp. And that's the online tool that we were describing before. And I'm not sure if we've actually put the CodeApp website in the chat. Again, we will include all of this in our follow-up email to you. Bill, I think I know it off by heart. And again, Bill Finzer is here, as well as Tim Erickson. They have helped us a lot in this project, and it is truly part of our co-design process to be able to have these amazing curriculum and software developers as part of our team. And we can continue to take questions, or you are welcome to sign off. Thank you so much for joining us on a Monday or Tuesday evening or day or whatever time zone you are in. We are just excited because I think, together we can all make such a difference in our students' lives. And the more we can think about integrating ideas for data fluency across the curriculum and whatever content discipline you specialize in, whatever audience you work with, whoever your students are, we can make the world a better place together. Thank you very much. Good night.